Dear listeners, the effect of the earthquake that took place in the southeast Turkey is still present, and the needs of the earthquake victims are still continue. We wanted to announce this situation from here again to those who may want to help like us. You can check out the links in our page, the Horai, on the Instagram for all kinds of donations and aid. Thank you.
Welcome to the Horai podcast, where we explore the intertwined stories of music and history. We are your hosts, a historian
and a musician. We hope you enjoy this journey through time. This week, we sail to the Aegean Sea to its rocky islands and shores, where it is very easy to trip and fall to one's death, but also very enjoyable to live in. Welcome to ancient Greece.
Rivers had been the bedrock of the early sedentary civilizations due to the ease of agriculture they provided. However, rivers were not the only bodies of water that people established themselves around. A big part of Bronze Age world was the island civilization of Minoan Crete, which very likely created the example for how long a seafaring and island-dwelling civilization should optimally be, as they were able to endure for a few thousand years and were contemporaries with long-lasting river civilizations of the Near East. The sea brought its own resources and its own opportunities to the people who lived around it. As a natural resource, it gave the additional abundance of fishing and begot the culture around shipping building. River civilizations had ships optimized for the river, but the sea required a different type of expertise and engineering to keep the sailors as safe as possible in these conditions. The seafaring civilization that carried on the blueprint laid by the Minoans is the Greek civilization, at least when it comes to its seafaring skills. Mycenaean Greeks who had migrated to the island of Crete and to the mainland surrounding it gradually replaced the dwindling Minoans, but took on many Minoan characteristics as they melted into the remnants of the once great island superpower and laid the beginnings of what we now know as the ancient Greek civilization. The classical period of ancient Greek timeline is the period for which we have the most resources and knowledge on, and unfortunately the periods that preceded it elude us in many ways. Today we will explore the classical incarnation of ancient Greek culture, without forgetting about the previous centuries that laid its foundation. Unlike river-based agricultural civilizations, Greeks had a civilization mainly based on trade and seafaring, as well as the steady growth of crops, therefore basing themselves around the Aegean and Adriatic seas along the eastern half of the Mediterranean. The environment they operated in was rocky, steep, and peppered with islands of all sizes, Crete being the largest island of them all, where the Bronze Age superpower of Minoan civilization was based before their eventual collapse. This environment may have made agriculture an additional source of maintaining their civilization instead of the only one, but as stated earlier, it created plenty of avenues for international trade to be established. Trading colonies throughout the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean were founded by the Greeks, and eventually many of the trading colonies they founded blossomed into fully fledged ancient cities, such as the ones they founded off the coast of western Anatolia. The Greeks have always had a close cultural relationship with the peoples of Anatolia, as evidenced by archaeological as well as written record. Even though the Greek epic poems are not transcriptions of historical events, obviously, the core of the story is the relationship between the peoples of mainland Greece and of Troy, located in the west of Asia Minor. The mainland of Greece is a mountainous and steep land, and therefore the peoples who live in the region are separated by geographical barriers, which resulted in greater differentiation among people and less homogeneity compared to those of the tightly connected river civilizations. But more on this under our culture subtitle. Farming and fishing were the two methods in which the ancient Greek peoples plied their trade. Most of the sedentary population in the mainland were farmers, but along the coast and the colonies, fishing establishments were also common. However, not every farming crop thrived the same in this environment, and therefore the Greeks excelled at other types of agricultural products. Wheat and barley were common, as it was in the ancient world, but not as common or successful of a crop compared to how the crop did in less mountainous and more river-centric regions of the world, such as Mesopotamia and Egypt. Wheat, due to the Greek mainland's mountains, was more demanding to grow, and thus did not yield more within a year. Barley was easier to grow than wheat as a base food product, but it is unlikely that that could also produce surplus to be enough for trading. The crop that is most famous and most successful to grow in Greece was the olive tree, with its fruits, the olive. The abundance and diversity of olives in the mainland, the surplus produced from the farming of it, in combination with seafaring, resulted in olive and olive byproducts such as olive oil and olive oil soap to be traded far and wide across the Mediterranean world, especially to regions where it was impossible or extremely difficult to grow olive trees. Olive tree is a fertile tree with a very long lifespan, and an olive grove could often maintain larger communities of people with the amount of economic prosperity it brings, as well as the food product it yields. Greek society was largely organized in city-states, caused by the geographic separation between these residential locations. These city-states operated independently from one another, and there was no pan-Hellenic ruler or a dominant power among the city-states, although few like Athens and Sparta were able to become more prosperous over time, enough to make a name for themselves. By the classical period, the period that we're exploring today, each city-state was ruled by its own people in a form of democracy instead of a monarch-like figure or an oligarchy. And this spelled a difference between Greece and the contemporary forms of government that was common in the world at the time. Athens was the first of the Greek city-states to adopt a citizen governing model called democracy, and Athenian democracy was the largest one out of all the city-states that adopted this type of government. By contrast, another large and prominent city-state, Sparta, did not adopt democracy unlike its rival and its neighbors, and they maintained their status as a small city-state ruled by a monarch figure. This is an example of how much city-states could differ, despite being populated by people of the same culture and language.
Ancient Greece by the classical period had a patriarchal and patrilineal society, much like the rest of the world, and how it had been for millennia. The role of men and women varied depending on the societal organization of each city-state, with some states giving more rights and public presence to women compared to others. Ancient Sparta is an example of this, where militarized society of the city-state opened different avenues for women to participate in public life. Of course, gender equality was out of the question. However, it is important to acknowledge these differences in practice. The people of Greece settled in the mainland, and the islands around Greece migrated from the north. With their solid seafaring technology, they were able to migrate and settle in areas of the Aegean, particularly to the coasts. The western coast of Anatolia was once witness to Doric and Ionic invasions, as both of these groups of people were known to be Greek speakers. Along with seafaring, winemaking is also an important part of Greek culture, as wine was easily made due to grapes favoring rocky regions. Wine was a huge part of ritual, entertainment, trade, and everyday life during this period. It would not be incorrect to say that grapes took as much space as olives in the culture that arose around agriculture. Ancient Greek religion was polytheistic, and Greek religion remained so until the spread of Christianity during the Roman period. Greek temples were constructed as largely open-air adjacent spaces to conduct rituals and sacrifice, and much of common people's religious practice was attending temple activities and giving votive offerings to various deities. Much like the culture of Sumer, epic poetry and myths being told through epic poetry was an important part of musical oral tradition. These epics remained a solid part of the culture, and they still hold an important place in Western history today. Ancient Greek culture encompassed the Greek peninsula, islands in the Aegean, much of the western half of Asia Minor, southern Italy and Sicily, and trading colonies spread around the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. What mapped this wide geography is the amount of artifacts that they have left behind belonging to their culture, such as images, items, and inscriptions. Among this material culture, 40 examples of music have also been found, but more on them later. As is the case with all long-lasting and relatively culturally cohesive civilizations, ancient Greece has been characterized by several eras that defined and shaped its distinctive identity. Let's briefly talk about Mycenaean period. One of the earliest known of these eras is now named the Mycenaean period. It is the name given to the time period between 1600 to 1200 BCE during the Bronze Age, where a Greek-speaking people started to settle around the southern parts of the Greek peninsula and many of the islands that are close to it, the main center of their culture being the big island of Crete. Mycenaean people inherited the hulking remains of the Minoan civilization that preceded their arrival in Crete. Unfortunately, what is known about them is limited compared to the peoples of other eras. Now we're going to briefly talk about Dorian period or the Greek Dark Ages. Dorian period is one of the tentative names given to the time period between 1200 to 800 BCE, as speakers of the Dorian dialect of Greek language began settling in the areas where Mycenaeans had been present during the Bronze Age. This cultural bottleneck period has left even less remains to the present day, as it followed a collective collapse of civilization around the Mediterranean. A combined effect of factors like resource shortage, climate change, other natural phenomena, and trading difficulties resulted in the most of the world's civilizations dissolve. This dissolution likely gave rise to migrations, which then impacted the sociocultural structure of a region, and Dorian-speaking people brought their own culture from their former location in central Greece. It was during these dark ages that a war between people of mainland Greece and Western Asia Minor broke out. Not much can be said for certain about this war, but it is very likely that it inspired the Trojan War of Homeric epics. As the epics were thought to be written down around 800 BCE, it is safe to assume that this war gave rise to poetry and songs for several centuries, similar to how the Epic of Gilgamesh was performed orally in the form of song accompanied by music. Taking place between around 800 to 100 BCE up to the Roman conquest of Greece, the classical period is one of the most well-known and popular periods of ancient Greek history, where the culture of city-states emerged and the Hellene identity became more distinctive and attested to. Later historians marked the beginning of this period with the presumed date when the epic poems of Iliad and Odyssey were written down. Compared to the previous eras that we have mentioned, the classical period has remarkably more artifacts that have survived to the present day, and the earliest sources where we draw what we know about ancient Greek music is from this period. Hymnos. This Greek word is the namesake of the word hymn, and in its ancient context, it meant sacred poems whose performances were always accompanied by a type of music. The vastest body of hymns from the classical period are called Homeric hymns, a given name to 34 hexameter poems that were most likely falsely attributed to the figure of Homer, whose existence is also debated. These hymn of poems address several Olympian deities such as Aphrodite, Apollo, Demeter, and Hermes, and praise these deities for their qualities. These hymns were most likely sung in a ritual context as part of the cults of different divinities. As such, they also can be important sources of what worship was like during the period in which they were sung. Many different types of unique instruments emerged from ancient Greek culture and are attested to in both visuals and writing, as well as an archaeological record. These instruments were used to accompany choruses that sung hymns and poems in contexts of ritual. Theater and public events in temple settings, social gatherings, or in settings of divinity festivals such as the Dionysian festival in Athens, the Olympic Games, weddings, funerals, and so on. Unfortunately, we couldn't find the sound of every instrument we mentioned in this episode, but surely we'll share with you the ones that we were able to find. Now we're going to mention about instruments. Fortunately for the present-day scholar, the amount of attestations for instrument in ancient Greece has helped their names and the methods of playing them to survive for millennia. Ancient Greeks made use of different categories of instruments, the same as any culture with a musical tradition. In this episode, we will explore a few examples of each type of instrument. If some of you already listened to our previous episode, I think you already got used to the term of the aulos. This instrument belongs to the woodwind family. The aulos was a common type of flute. More specifically, two-piped reed instrument wherein the two long pipes were held separately with each hand to be played. It contained finger holes along the reed pipe, a mouthpiece with reed that connected the two pipes, and a long tube at the tip to beat one string against to create different flows of melodies. The way to play the aulos appears in case paintings, as well as the contexts and settings in which the instrument was played. These images suggest that the performers with this flute would play it in unison, maybe pointing to a rule that this flute would not be played in isolation. An important setting where people made ample use of the aulos is during rituals dedicated to Dionysos, the famous god of fertility, madness, and wine. The instrument usually accompanied rituals and during theater performances as supporting music to the chorus and to the play itself. Outside of public festivals, the worship of Dionysos in smaller scale was overwhelmingly done by women of different ages and social status, and the presence of the aulos is likely within their more intimate rituals as well. The sound of the aulos and the consumption of wine as the special domain of Dionysos induced a manic trance in worshippers in honor of the god. Music, specifically the music of woodwinds, as a tool was powerful and effective in manifesting quality of the god that the worshippers invoked. Here is the sound of aulos. And also, another instrument, if some of you already listened to ancient Egypt, I think you already heard about the instrument lyre. The lyre is one of the most well-known and well-attested instruments of ancient Greece. As a simple string instrument, it is the precursor to many other string instruments that were invented later in history. It is played by strumming its 7 strings with a plectrum, similar to how guitar can be played today. The lyre was commonly made of a tortoiseshell sound box with stretched oxide with 7 strings tied on it in 7 different lengths, giving the way of multiple different notes that timbres. The performer's right hand strummed the strings with plectrum, while their left hand fingers touched strings to create the aforementioned different notes. Similar to how the aulos was associated with Dionysian rituals and mania, the lyre was most commonly associated with the rituals of Apollo, the god of light, prophecy, learning, and the arts, especially music and poetry. Later visual depictions of Apollo show him holding or playing a lyre overcome with inspiration. The lyre was another instrument that bridged the mortal and the divine world in this way. Performances with the lyre accompanied recitation of epic poetry, specifically verses from Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. In rituals, both men and women are shown to be playing the instrument and participating in the festivals dedicated to Apollo, and in weddings, where it was most commonly played. Ancient Athenian culture also chose the lyre as a primary instrument. If an Athenian was of the social status to receive an education, learning to play lyre well would be the part of their curriculum as a core element of this education. Even though women usually were not qualified to receive a formal education in the way that men were, opportunities to learn how to play the instrument were present in their lives, and many made names for themselves as poets and musicians as well. Smaller lyres were considered to be proper and gender appropriate for women, and many of them learned it at a young age as amateurs, with a few advancing their skills later in life to take part in settings where the lyre would be a staple instrument. Weddings and small gatherings were the most common secular settings, and the lyre is the one instrument that is attested as a recreational instrument as well, thus explaining its wide availability and diversity of its players. Here is the sound of lyre. The kithara. Exploration of the lyre brings us to another string instrument, the kithara, namesake of the modern guitar. Functionally, the kithara is a large lyre that resembles a modern harp the most, and has a lower pitch than its smaller predecessor. And different from the lyre, which can be played with the musician in multiple different positions, the kithara is usually played while standing, once again similar to the modern-day harp. Another difference between kithara and the lyre is the demographic that played it. Where the lyre was available to most people in society in contrast to the exclusively professional musicians who would be able to play kithara in various settings. As it was mostly played by professional performers, the kithara's place was in the public of ritual processions, sacred ceremonies, and of course the theater. The kithara provided a wider range of notes and musical techniques than the simply constructed lyre, which explains why it needed to be played with more sophisticated methods by people who have received sophisticated training. Here is the sound of kithara. We're gonna mention about the clappers. All ancient cultures made use of clapper-like percussion instruments, and ancient Greece was no exception. Structurally similar to other types of clappers found around the world, they were made of 2 concave pieces of shell, wood, reed, or metal, which were loosely connected in their end with leather strips, allowing an opening of up to 90 degrees. So that the player could open and close the shells to achieve the clapping sound. Similar to modern castanets, These instruments were held and played in pairs with both hands busy and were useful as creating intermediary rhythms accompanying drums. One notable difference between clappers and all other instruments mentioned thus far is the factor of dancing. The musician who played the clapper also took on the role of a rhythmic dancer, whereas in other instruments the musician would be more static, maybe except for the lyre players who would have more freedom of movement. As common instruments, they make an appearance in various types of settings with minimal limitations, and since they were relatively easy to play, the musician's dancing abilities would be more at the forefront. And the other instrument that I'm gonna mention to you is drums. Universally known and universally played, the drum was the main percussion instrument in the ancient world as it is today. The circular shape of the drum has not changed through the ages, and neither has the methods of playing it. Most drums would be built on a circular panel made of a hard material with animal skins stretched over it, although sometimes the skin would not be hollow underneath to create a less cavernous drum sound. Similar to the clappers, the use of the drum was eclectic, and it made an appearance in all types of settings, from ritual to secular, and most layers of society had access to this instrument. In secular contexts, it would be played by musicians in a band, and in a ritual contexts, it could be played by the worshippers without the need of a musician in the middle. Here is the sound of drums. Performance of instruments. The aulos, the lyre and the kithara, were the instruments that could be played solo as well as in a band, and the solo potential of these instruments gave rise to musical competitions. These events were organized in order to find the best and most talented performers within their respective communities. An example of such a person whose name has survived to present day is Sekadas of Argos, I hope this pronunciation is right, who won the prize for solo aulos playing at the Pythian Games in 586, 582, 578 BCE, making him a notable musician for his multiple victories. In the next episode, we will continue the topic of music in ancient Greece. Stay tuned. Once again, see you at the beautiful coasts of Aegean, everyone! If you like the contact or to get more information about us, you can follow our visual storytelling page, the Horai, on Instagram.
Cheers!